This is the new 2021 Lexus IS350, and it's Lexus's sports sedan. This is designed to compete with the BMW 3 Series, the Mercedes C-Class, the Infiniti Q50, and other cool performance-y, luxury-oriented sedans. The IS350 has been updated for the 2021 model year to be more competitive than before. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my new online enthusiast car auction website for modern enthusiast cars. We have daily auctions of cool cars from the 1980s and up, and if you're looking to buy a cool modern enthusiast car, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. And if you're looking to sell a cool enthusiast car from the modern era, check out Cars and Bids. You will get the most interest and the most money. carsandbids.com. First, a little overview. The IS first came out for the 2001 model year, and it's been redesigned a few times since then. The last big change was for 2014. Now, back then, Lexus devoted a lot of resources to updating the IS because sports sedans were hot. But in the years since, buyer interest has started to fade as more and more shoppers have moved on from sedans and toward SUVs. As a result, Lexus is slowing down its investment in sedans. The larger GS sports sedan is going away finally, and this new IS isn't really new. It has new styling and some tech upgrades, but it's not fully redesigned like the new BMW 3 Series. In fact, the engine choices are the same as before. The base model uses a turbo 4-cylinder, or you can upgrade to a 3.5-liter V6. In this, the F Sport model, that V6 makes 311 horsepower. And today I'm going to take you on a tour of the 2021 Lexus IS and show you what else it has. First, I'll show you a few interesting quirks and features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features on the outside of the new IS. Now, like I said, this car wasn't fully redesigned for 21, but it was updated, and the most noticeable changes are on the outside. Up front, you can see the grille is more aggressive, at least on this F Sport model, for kind of a bolder stance up front. Probably the most obvious change is on the side. This little line in the back door has changed. It's actually come up a bit. The old model had it too, but now it's different than before, and the side profile looks a little different as a result. And in back, you also have a totally new taillight design. The previous taillights kind of curve down, these curve up, and now you have a light bar going across the back. This stuff doesn't sound like very comprehensive changes, I'm aware, but just looking at this car, you can clearly distinguish it from the earlier IS models, to the point where when I first saw it, I thought it had been fully redesigned just based on the updates and changes to the outside. It is a pretty thorough revision to the exterior. But that isn't true in here. While there are noticeable changes to the outside of the new IS, the interior is very similar to the outgoing model. Not all that much new stuff in here, although frankly, that's not that big of a deal. Frankly, I thought this interior was pretty futuristic when Lexus first launched it back in 2014, and it doesn't really feel like it's fallen behind all that much. And it means you have two excellent quirks from the prior IS model. One is in the gauge cluster. You turn on the car and you can see that this big circle gauge slides into position when you start things. That is a little bit strange, and it gets stranger. If you want to change your information display in the gauge cluster, you press this little button and the cluster slides again to show you different information. Press it again and it slides back and forth. You can slide it around. That is pretty cool. This is not an electronic display. This is an actual real gauge cluster that's moving around in there with the push of a button, and I just love that. I think that is one of the coolest, neat tricks to show your passengers in the entire car industry. And there's another one of those in here too. It's how you change the temperature with the climate control system. You have these little sliders. You just slide your finger and you can see the temperature changes easily. Most cars have little buttons where you have to push to change it, or dials. In this car, these sliders work fantastically, and I truly wish more cars would adopt this. I know a lot of people are skeptical of sliders for volume or various other things, but it works beautifully for the climate control temperature in here. It is a fantastic idea. But anyway, like I said, this interior is a little older, but it doesn't really feel that old. There's no real drawbacks in here except for the infotainment system. I hate Lexus's remote touch infotainment. You have basically this pad in the center and you move your finger around on the pad to click on stuff on the screen, and it's hard to line things up exactly, and it's just terribly designed. I would love it so much more if it was simply a touchscreen. But now it is. Take a look at this. Lexus has changed the infotainment so it can be used as a touchscreen. You can tap the screen and it will respond, so you no longer have to use the terrible remote touch in the center. And now nobody ever will use this again. This is just wasted space, and you now have a touchscreen. Now this touchscreen isn't quite as responsive as some other automakers, and the screen itself isn't as large as in a lot of other vehicles, but it is a huge step forward in the right direction, and I hope that this means Lexus will abandon remote touch entirely in its future vehicles and go solely to a touchscreen setup, because it's just so much better. And by the way, on the subject of the gauge cluster, one other thing I love is the way the display changes when you change drive modes. You can see right now I'm in normal, it looks pretty standard. I go into sport, it gets a little sportier. I go into sport plus, and now look at it, it's really aggressive and cool. I love seeing those changes. They really confirm that you've gone into a sportier drive mode. But anyway, while the upgrade to touchscreen infotainment is a big deal in the new IS, I must say this car does have a big technology drawback to it. It just isn't as good as rivals that have been fully redesigned and the latest features have been implemented. For instance, like I said, that screen, pretty small, pretty far away from the driver, not well integrated into the center console. In the gauge cluster, as much as I love the little slidey dial, it doesn't allow for a lot of configuration like Audi or Mercedes-Benz, where you have a full screen and you can do all sorts of different things with it. And don't get me started on the turn signals in this car. You put on the turn signal and then the stalk pops back into its original position, so turning it off is a challenge. You can't just push it back down, that doesn't turn it off. You can't just push it the other way, that doesn't turn it off. You have to make half a turn the other way, which is counterintuitive and stupid. Everyone else has abandoned these turn signals, but the Lexus IS, being kind of dated, it still is using them, and it's a shame. And next up we move on to the back seat in the new IS, where you can see it's pretty much just a back seat. The interior room back here is fairly standard for a sports sedan. It actually feels a little bit bigger than a 3 Series, frankly, but not exactly comfortable. This isn't a large sedan. The back seat is not intended to be used very frequently. If you want that, you'll need something a little bigger, an SUV, something like that, but it's doable. Now in the trunk, again, same kind of deal, large enough, nothing unusual, spectacular, exciting, not particularly huge or particularly small. It's just a trunk like you might expect in a car like this. Nothing weird there. And finally, we move on to the last interesting part of the new IS, and that would be the powertrain. Now, like I said, this is carried over from the prior IS, and Toyota and Lexus have been using this engine for a long time. 3.5 liter V6, naturally aspirated, 311 horsepower, and that's just not all that impressive of a figure. It was when this engine first started to be used in the Lexus IS, which was like 14 years ago. They may have updated it since then, but the power hasn't changed much, but for rivals it has. This is the top line IS model with 311 horsepower. The top line BMW 3 Series has 380 horsepower. The Audi S4 has 350 horsepower. They all walk in circles around the IS. This powertrain used to be a muscular engine, made this car super competitive. Now it is very much behind the times, and that kind of illustrates Lexus's level of commitment to sedans. They didn't want to bother updating or changing this engine, putting more power in this car, because they know people just aren't buying it even if they did that. All right, driving the new Lexus IS. Now, two things I want to talk about before I get into driving experience. Number one, when I became a car journalist, the Lexus IS was the very first car whose press launch I went on, back the 2014 model when it was last redesigned. And I remember I was sitting there listening to the presentation about the car, and the Lexus guy walks out and he says, "The new Lexus IS, because it's time to stop blending in and start blending out." And I thought to myself, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. What business have I gotten myself into? But it's been better since then. Now, number two thing I want to talk about with this car isn't all that good. And that's actually by design. We all know that if Lexus really wanted to spend the money, they could create a car that's just as good as BMW 3 Series, Audi A4, just like the IS was when it came out in 14, and just like when it came out in 06. It was a great car then, super competitive. But this time they haven't redesigned it, they've just facelifted it. And that tells you less about Lexus and the IS and more about the state of the car industry right now. Lexus is not stupid. Toyota and Lexus are probably your smartest car companies. And they are very aware of what's going on in cars and SUVs and trends. And it just doesn't make sense anymore to spend the money to develop a vehicle, even if it will sell better and do better than BMW and Audi. You'd rather put that money where the buyers are, SUVs. So this car gets a fairly minor facelift after 7 years on the market. It's starting to feel old. So with that in mind, let's talk driving experience. And again, this car just isn't really all that good. Like I said, 311 horsepower. Now, as I mentioned, in 06, this engine came out, or a 3.5 liter V6. They may have changed it since then, but it had 306 horsepower at the time. I remember I was in college. I thought it was the craziest thing ever. A sports sedan with 306 horsepower. At the time, BMW had 225. Okay, it was a big deal. Well, guess what? 15 years later, Lexus still has about the same power, and it's just not great. The car doesn't really handle all that well. It's good, but it's good for like 2015-16 standards. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the interior of this car is good. It always has been. I've always liked how this car looks on the inside, but that's not really enough to overcome its other deficits. The touchscreen helps. The interior quality in general helps. It's a nice looking car. The facelift helps, but ultimately BMW and Audi and Mercedes, they are the real players in this segment. And Lexus is playing catch up. And at this point, it's clear they know they're playing catch up and they don't care. They don't view this segment as really worth their full attention and effort anymore. So my view is, get a car from a brand that does. And so that's the 2021 Lexus IS350 F Sport. This is a nice sports sedan, although I'm not really sure how much that matters to people anymore. The IS used to do 50,000 sales a year here in the United States, no problem. Now it struggles to get above 25,000 sales a year. The dwindling number of sports sedan buyers seem to be focused on BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Audi. Still, this is a good car, even if it wasn't fully redesigned. And now it's time to give the new IS a Doug score. And the Doug score is here against rivals. The simple truth is that the IS lags behind. It's not beautiful, nor particularly engaging to drive, nor particularly high-tech, even with the latest update. Simply put, this is a facelifted car that really needed a redesign to stay competitive, and so it just isn't really competitive. The sole benefit the IS has over competitors is quality, which admittedly is a big one. The interior still looks great with great materials, and of course Lexus reliability is fantastic, but people buy sports sedans for so many reasons beyond reliability, like handling and acceleration and brand name and technology, and the new IS just lags behind in all that stuff. Maybe that's smart though, as Lexus is clearly shifting its focus